Hello and welcome to the Wheels of History Podcast, Episode 2. I'm your host, Brian Boyles. Today's episode is part 2 of a 4-part series on the Six-Day War called The Road to War. This episode takes us from the end of the Suez War against Egypt in 1956 all the way up to the start of the Six-Day War in 1967. One week before the Six-Day War begins, the Soviet ambassador to Israel, Dmitry Shuvakin, goes to deliver a message to the Israeli Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. The Prime Minister is woken up and meets Shuvakin, still wearing his pajamas. Shuvakin delivers a message from the Soviet Premier, Alexei Kosygin, stating in part, quote, "If Israel commits aggression and military action begins, then we would render assistance to the countries which would be the victims of aggression." End quote. And he then demands to know if Israel intends to fire the first shot. Eshkol's response? Quote, "The Egyptians, sir, have already fired the first shot in this war." End quote. So when does the war start? In some cases, there is a very clearly defined separation between peace and war, such as the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor or the German invasion of Poland. But if you remember from the last episode, in Israel, the peace secured after the War of Independence was never entirely peaceful. The Syrians fired artillery shells on Jewish farming communities along the Jordan River. The Egyptians sponsored Palestinian guerrilla raids into Israel, killing nearly 500 civilians between 1949 and 1956. And as we'll see in this episode, the scale of violence against Israel and the threat by the Arab nations will only grow. The only question is, what will be the tipping point that moves this conflict from low-level violence to all-out war? So in this episode, we're going to look first at the efforts by the Arab nations to unify and work together to destroy Israel, and then we'll look more specifically at the escalating violence that eventually leads to the Six-Day War in 1967. If you recall from Part 1, we ended that episode by looking at the Suez War, in which Israel, the United Kingdom, and France fought against Egypt over the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956. Due to the diplomatic intervention by the United States and the Soviet Union, the European powers abandoned their campaign to retain ownership of the canal, though the Israelis did manage to conquer the Sinai Peninsula, which lies between Israel's borders and the Suez Canal. In the aftermath of the war, Israel agreed to give the Sinai back to Egypt in exchange for United Nations peacekeepers, a force known as the United Nations Emergency Force, or UNIF, occupied observation posts along the Israeli-Egyptian border, particularly around the Gaza Strip, which was occupied by Egypt, and adjacent to the Straits of Tiran at a place called Sharm el-Sheikh. Since Egypt closed the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping, the only practical way for Israel to access the Indian Ocean is through their port on the Gulf of Aqaba, a town called Eilat. And all the shipping has to go through the Straits of Tiran, which is a narrow channel that can be closed by placing artillery at Sharm el-Sheikh. So, Israel gave the Sinai back to Egypt in exchange for the UNIF peacekeepers along the border, and these peacekeepers occupied positions on the Egyptian side of the 1949 armistice lines. These peacekeepers were also present at Sharm el-Sheikh in order to allow the Israeli shipping to freely transit through the Straits of Tiran. And these all constituted efforts by Israel to translate their military victory against Egypt into a more stable peace. Now Nasser, the president of Egypt, has a vision for the Arab people going far beyond his own country. In the 1950s, many independent Arab countries emerged on the world stage as the European powers withdrew from their colonies, and the Arab people are trying to find their identity. Nasser sees himself as a leader not only of Egypt, but as the leader of the Arab peoples and seeks to unify them under one flag. He is charismatic and a popular figure among the Arabs, and he sets himself against the traditional Arab monarchies in countries such as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, or Iraq. His efforts also seem to bear fruit, too. In 1958, Syria and Egypt unite into a single country called the United Arab Republic. And Through supporting violent measures such as assassinations or bombings or coups, the Iraqi monarchy is also toppled in 1958 by a revolution. Similar efforts to overthrow the Jordanian monarchy are only averted by U.S. efforts to stabilize the regime. Now, many of these efforts at unifying the Arab world fall short of Nasser's aims. The Iraqi Republic ends up becoming a competitor for leadership in the Arab world instead of becoming a member of the United Arab Republic. And likewise, Syria would break free of the United Arab Republic a mere 3 years after unification due to dissatisfaction about state control over the Syrian economy and Egyptian officers assuming key leadership positions that were formerly held by the Syrians. But Nasser's influence, power, and drive made him a central figure in the Arab world, and with the strength of Egypt behind him, he posed the greatest threat to Israel. Now, Nasser has no love for Israel. Beyond the general Arab sentiment that the creation of Israel was a catastrophe and needs to be undone, he fought against the Israelis in the War of Independence, in which he was trapped with over 4,000 other Egyptian troops in the Fallujah pocket for 4 months before the armistice ended the war. However, Nasser saw the failure of Arab unity against Israel as being a key weakness that needed to be addressed, and he preferred to pursue efforts to unify the Arab world first so they could gather their strength and then go on to crush Israel. This put him in opposition with some of the other Arab nations who wanted to conquer Israel sooner rather than later. Thankfully, the UN peacekeepers gave Nasser a convenient excuse where he could provide verbal and moral support for the Palestinian cause without actually having to pursue actions that would lead to a direct confrontation with Israel. Globally, Nasser begins aligning himself towards the Soviet Union, taking them on as his primary arms supplier, which transforms Egypt into the most powerful Arab military in the region. This military force is ironically employed against his fellow Arabs. In 1962, the monarchy in Yemen is overthrown in a military coup, and the officers leading the coup are supportive of Nasser and vice versa. However, the deposed ruler flees to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis back an insurgency to restore the monarchy. Egypt sends troops to support the new regime, leading to a counterinsurgency fight that would drag on for years. This war, now called the North Yemen Civil War, would last for 8 years, and the Egyptians would maintain tens of thousands of soldiers in Yemen, peaking at 55,000 soldiers in 1965. Indeed, the Egyptian army didn't leave Yemen until after the Six-Day War was concluded. Now, during this war, the Egyptians encountered many of the same frustrations the U.S. would experience in Vietnam, and the Egyptians even resorted to using chemical weapons against the rebels, as well as conducting some airstrikes into Saudi Arabia during the war. Alright, now we're going to take a look to the north of Israel, to Syria. Syria is a country that experienced a lot of political instability following their independence in 1946, much of this being internally driven regime change. The first president of the Syrian Republic was ousted from power 3 years into his term by his own chief of staff. He, in turn, was overthrown by a military coup 4 months later, and was then tried and executed. In fact, aside from its first president, the longest any Syrian ruler held power between 1946 and 1967 is actually when Syria was part of the United Arab Republic and Nasser was president, 3 years and 219 days. Even though the Syrian constitution has 5-year terms for presidents. After breaking away from the United Arab Republic in the 1961 coup, that regime lasts for 2 years before another coup occurs in 1963, and then a third takes place in 1966. In spite of this internal turmoil, on the political stage, the Syrians set themselves up in opposition to Egypt, accusing Nasser of selling out the Palestinians for American wheat shipments. Now, the Syrians signed a pact with the Soviet Union, in which they received military and economic aid, as well as hundreds of military advisors to help train the Syrian army. Indeed, Soviet relations with Syria are warmer than they are with the Egyptians, since Nasser outlaws the Communist Party, and ultimately, in the years following the Six-Day War, the Soviets would establish a permanent naval base in Syria at Tartus, which the Russians still maintain to this day, and is part of the reason for why the Russians intervened in the Syrian Civil War. Now, the Syrians occupied the Golan Heights along the Jordan River in the Sea of Galilee. These mountains rise up several thousand feet above the Jordan River Valley, and they overlook the Israeli farming communities along the border. This offers the Assyrians both excellent defensive positions, as well as good observation posts for their artillery fire. Along the armistice line, which runs roughly along the Jordan River and the east bank of the Sea of Galilee, there are occasional border incidents between the two countries. There are also 3 demilitarized zones along this border, land that was occupied by the Syrians in the Israeli War of Independence, but was within the borders of British Palestine. Some of these incidents in the demilitarized zones include the Syrians firing at Israeli tractors that are trying to plow the land there, and then the Israelis would sometimes respond with tank fire or artillery fire of their own. Tensions escalate in 1964 when the Israelis complete a project to channel water from the Sea of Galilee to the Negev Desert for irrigation. Although this diversion fell within the limits of the Jordan Valley Unified Water Plan, the Arab League didn't ratify the plan because it would imply a formal recognition of Israel. In 1964, faced with the prospect of the Israeli water project strengthening the Israeli economy and increasing the number of people Israel can support with its agriculture, the Arab League decides to divert water from the Jordan River at its source in the Golan Heights. And at the Arab League summit, their resolution stated in part, quote, "The establishment of Israel is the basic threat that the Arab nation in its entirety has agreed to forestall. And since the existence of Israel is a danger that threatens the Arab nation, the diversion of the Jordan waters by it multiplies the dangers to Arab existence." End quote. And that the collective Arab military preparations will, quote, "constitute the ultimate practical means for the final liquidation of Israel." End quote. If successful, this Arab attempt to divert the Jordan headwaters would significantly reduce the amount of water Israel could use for irrigation, and Israel responds by saying such a diversion would be an infringement on their sovereign rights. As construction begins at this diversion project, more incidents occur, such as the Syrians firing on Israeli farmers, the Israelis destroying Syrian tanks and earth-moving equipment, and then when the Syrians move construction work out of artillery range, the Israelis start conducting airstrikes and even shoot down some Syrian planes that try to intercept them. Syria's inability to prevent the Israeli actions with conventional arms convinces them to seek indirect methods of engaging the Israelis, so they began sponsoring Palestinian terrorist groups to make attacks in Israel, the first such attack taking place in 1964. Due to Syria's pact with the Soviet Union, the Israelis are reluctant to directly strike back at the Syrians out of fear of sparking Soviet intervention. However, the pace of these attacks increased rapidly, and by 1967 there are about 300 attacks per year. These attacks range from laying landmines to blowing up buildings or shooting at Israelis with small arms fire. Many of these Palestinian attacks are launched from the Jordanian-occupied West Bank. And so, wanting to respond to the Palestinian attacks in some way, but unwilling to risk a potential war with the Soviet Union, the Israelis decide to apply pressure on Jordan and conduct retaliatory strikes in the West Bank instead. And now that we're getting to the West Bank, let's go take a closer look at Jordan and their role in the lead-up to the Six-Day War. During World War I, what would become Jordan was part of the Ottoman Empire. Following the end of the war, the British established the Emirate of Transjordan meaning on the other side of the Jordan River, since Transjordan was located east of the Jordan River, and British Palestine was established to the west of the Jordan River. Abdullah I, the Emir of Transjordan, and the person who would become the king of Transjordan following World War II, was actually born in Saudi Arabia and had taken part in the Arab Revolt in World War I. Abdullah's reign, though, was on shaky ground. After all, while he was an Arab, he was not from the region and had been put on the throne by the British. Now that the British are gone, and facing populist opposition, particularly in the form of Nasser and his pan-Arab endeavors, legitimacy becomes a very big concern for the ruling dynasty. Complicating things are the Jordanian occupation of the West Bank in the Israeli War of Independence. Following that occupation and annexation, the country changed their name to Jordan to reflect that they controlled territory on both sides of the Jordan River. However, this put a large population of Palestinian Arabs under Jordanian control. To be more specific, the population of Transjordan was about 400,000 at the time of Israeli independence, and the West Bank held 900,000 Palestinians. And so, despite vastly increasing the nation's population, this made the political situation even more unstable. Just consider the following. The king of Jordan is a foreign monarch put on the throne by an imperial power, and that imperial power has since departed the region. And now the original Jordanian population is outnumbered 2-1 by Palestinian Arabs. Indeed, the king of Jordan, Abdullah I, was killed by a Palestinian assassin in 1951 when Abdullah was visiting the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Why was he killed? Well, partly because the Palestinians wanted their own state and they didn't want to be annexed by Jordan, and partly because Abdullah I was taking steps to try and reach some sort of formal peace agreement with the Israelis. Abdullah's grandson, Hussein, was 16 years old when the assassination took place, and he was there at the mosque, seeing his grandfather killed before his very own eyes. A year later, Hussein would take the throne as king of Jordan, and I'm sure that certainly left a lasting mark on Hussein as he is trying to walk this tightrope. He can't be too soft on Israel for fear of the Palestinian riots, unrest, or assassination, and yet he can't be too hard on Israel because Israel is stronger militarily, and he fears being hung out to dry by Egypt and Syria since they want his monarchy replaced by a populist government. This fear of being deposed or killed is not an idle one either. The Iraqi monarchy that was overthrown in the 1958 coup was led by King Faisal II, who was the cousin of King Hussein. Indeed, by 1966, over 13 years of rule, Hussein survives 12 coup or assassination attempts. So, King Hussein knows he has to tread very carefully to ensure his own survival and that of his dynasty. Alright, so now that we've considered Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in turn, we're now going to follow the escalating tensions that ultimately led to the crisis that sparked the Six-Day War. One factor is outside influence from the Soviet Union. Way back in February 1960, the Soviets warned Nasser that the Israelis planned to attack on February 22nd. And remember, at this point in history, no one has reconnaissance satellites yet, so outside of the United Arab Republic's own intelligence assets, they have no way to verify the veracity of this claim. Nasser believes the Soviets and responds by moving 2 divisions of troops into the Sinai Peninsula, catching everyone off guard. Israel mobilizes their forces in response, and there's a standoff. The situation ends in March when the Egyptians decide to withdraw their forces. Over the 1960s, there are efforts by the Arab nations to adopt a more unified front against Israel. Some of it are diplomatic pledges, such as the 1962 pledge by Iraq, Egypt, and Syria to join forces to liberate Palestine, that is, to wipe Israel off the map. In 1963, Iraq discusses a union with Egypt and Syria, and the Iraqi flag is even changed to have 3 stars, one for Egypt, one for Syria, and one for Iraq. The Syrians adopt an identical flag, which they will keep until 1971. In 1964, the Arabs at a summit agreed to create the United Arab Command in order to improve the ability for the Arab nations and militaries to work together, much in the same way that NATO has a number of conventions that help the NATO militaries be able to work and train together and fight more effectively. The United Arab Command is particularly made with an eye to helping the Iraqi Army and Air Force meaningfully participate in a war against Israel. This command, which the Egyptians lead, is set to become operational in 1967, the year that the Six-Day War breaks out. Follow-on summits lead to the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Palestinian Liberation Army for the elimination of the, quote, Israeli aggression, end quote. Now, in spite of these efforts towards unity, there is a lot of internal squabbling and dissent among the Arab ranks. As discussed earlier, Syria accuses Egypt of being soft on Israel and selling out the Palestinians, while Nasser accuses Syria of stabbing Egypt in the back and dragging them into a war before the Arab nations are ready. Jordan accuses Nasser of, quote, hiding behind UNEF's skirts, end quote. And for its part, Jordan doesn't want to host foreign military forces within their border, like Iraqi army forces, probably out of some concerns over this being a threat to the monarchy if they get a little too concerned with pan-Arab populism. Likewise, the Jordanians don't want to host the Palestinian Liberation Army units in the West Bank for similar reasons of regime security. Now, none of these nations are actually concerned about the Palestinian cause for the sake of the Palestinian Arabs themselves. They are all trying to use the Palestinian cause as a way to bolster their own prestige or tear down their opponents. Egypt pays lip service to the Palestinians while avoiding doing anything materially against the Israelis, thanks to the UN peacekeepers, and a desire to attack Israel years down the road when the Arab nations are stronger and more united. Syria sponsors Palestinian terrorist attacks both as a way of contrasting their actions to Nasser, who's doing nothing, and out of hopes that Israeli retaliation might spark a general war with the Arab nations in Israel, which they assume they're going to win. Furthermore, by launching these attacks out of the West Bank, they are inviting Israeli pressure and retaliation against Jordan. And the Syrians hope that this might undermine the Jordanian monarchy so they can replace it with the more populist regime. Now, the Jordanians are just trying to survive, stuck between a rock and a hard place, between the Palestinian unrest at home and opposition by Nasser and his allies abroad. Now, because Nasser is unable to have enough clout or authority to actually focus and direct the other Arab nations, and thus bring them to heel while they try to build their strength and unity, this creates a volatile, unstable environment in which the most reckless party moves the ball forward and the other states have to match it in order to retain influence and prestige. There are no stabilizing influences here. The U.S. has little influence with any of the Arab states except Jordan, and the Soviets are arming the Arab nations as fast as possible in order to gain influence in the Middle East and counter Western influence in Turkey and Iran. Amongst all of this, Arab rhetoric is strong and makes no qualms about their desire to destroy Israel. For example, the Syrian chief of staff, Salah Jadid, urged the Arab masses to, quote, kindle the spark, end quote, of war against Israel, and that, quote, every soldier in our army feels that Israel must be wiped off the map, end quote. Nasser, in November 1965, said, quote, our aim is the full restoration of the rights of the Palestinian people. In other words, we aim at the destruction of the state of Israel. The immediate aim, perfection of Arab military might. The national aim, the eradication of Israel, end quote. In 1967, the Iraqi president, Abdurrahman Aref, said, quote, the existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. This is our opportunity to wipe out the ignominy which has been with us since 1948. Our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map. We shall, God willing, meet in Tel Aviv and Haifa, end quote. Besides this belligerent rhetoric, one of the milestones on the road to war is what became known as the Samu Raid, November 13, 1966. This was a raid by the Israelis against Jordan in response to Palestinian terrorist attacks launched from the West Bank. The Israelis launched a punitive raid into the West Bank with 400 men, 10 tanks, and 40 half-tracks, intent on destroying a police station and some buildings in retaliation for a landmine that killed 3 and wounded 6 people. Their intent is that the local Arabs would realize the Israeli raid took place because of the Palestinian terrorist attacks, and that the people would in turn appeal to King Hussein to clamp down on such activities. This raid would also serve a double purpose of a show of force to deter Jordan and Syria. The initial advance goes well. The Israelis demolish a police station at one village and then head to the village of Samu. However, en route, reconnaissance forces report a Jordanian infantry company is approaching in a convoy. The Israelis lay in ambush, but then the raid turned into an intense firefight that lasts for 3 hours with casualties on both sides. The Jordanian and Israeli aircraft even get involved in the fight. The Israelis end up suffering 11 casualties, and the Jordanians suffer 70. Now this raid sparks outrage on all sides. The local Palestinians, instead of appealing to Hussein to stop the terrorist activity, instead they're outraged at Hussein and riot, burning effigies of the king. They're angry because they think that King Hussein didn't protect them against the Israelis. The United Nations condemns Israel for violating the General Armistice Agreement from 1949, and the Arab League condemns Jordan for failing to protect the Palestinians. Even those in the West question the logic of responding to a Syrian-sponsored terrorist attack by attacking Jordan, a country which is one of the friendlier Arab states to Israel and the only pro-Western Arab state in the region. Then, in April 1967, the Syrians shell Israeli settlements near the border, and Israel responds with airstrikes. This leads to a dogfight over the skies of Damascus, in which the Syrians lose 6 aircraft to 0 Israeli aircraft lost. Finally, in May, the Soviets stir the pot once more. You see, in May 14, 1967, an Egyptian envoy returns from talks with the Soviets and brings news to Nasser. The Soviets say that Israel is going to invade Syria, and soon. Ironically, May 14th, which is Israel's Independence Day, during a military parade that's held in Jerusalem, the Israelis intentionally leave their heavy equipment, such as tanks, out of the parade to avoid inflaming tensions. Instead, the Egyptians see this and interpret it through the lens of that Soviet report. They assume the Israelis aren't parading with heavy equipment because all that heavy equipment is up north getting ready to attack the Syrians. And once again, in this era, intelligence gathering capabilities are pretty limited. Only the Soviets and Americans have spy satellites, and these satellites were the kind where you had to drop the film in a capsule from space back to the ground, which you would then have to find, recover, and develop. So, Nasser is inclined to believe the Soviet intelligence once again and responds accordingly. Much like he did in 1960, Nasser mobilizes his forces and begins moving several divisions into the Sinai, catching Israel and the world by surprise. However, a key difference this time is that he removes the UN peacekeepers from the border and the Straits of Tiran. There is some debate over whether he intended merely to relocate them somewhere else or to evict them entirely from the country, but Nasser's right-hand man, Abdel Hakim Amir, a close friend to Nasser and the chief of staff of the Egyptian army, he interprets it as an eviction. Then the UN rolls over and departs without a fight or even bureaucratic delays. You see, when the UN peacekeepers were originally established following the Suez War, they were stationed on the Egyptian side of the armistice line. And so, when the Egyptians told them to leave, the UN leadership interpreted the original agreement as an invitation by the Egyptians to stay on their territory, and so once the Egyptians removed that consent, they thought they had to depart. Now that the Egyptians control Sharm el-Sheikh, adjacent to the Strait of Tiran, Nasser could no longer hide behind UNEF's skirts, as the Jordanians accused him of. With Egyptian troops at the straits, he had to close the channel to Israeli shipping, or he would be directly seen as selling out the Palestinians. And now, the Palestinian issue, which Nasser had kept on the back burner for a decade, was suddenly back on the table. The Israelis respond to the crisis in a similar manner to 1960. They mobilize 60 to 70,000 troops, and there's a standoff in the desert. However, the closure of the straits makes this a much more serious crisis than in 1960. You see, over the years since the Suez War, Israel developed its port on the Red Sea at Eilat, and that port is now essential for receiving deliveries of oil, which ironically comes from Iran. Back then, it was still ruled by the Shah and was pro-Western. And so, with the Egyptians closing the straits, that amounts to a de facto blockade of Israel, an act of war. Israel is a small country surrounded by enemies who are sworn to wiping it off the face of the earth. And in order to deter its enemies, Israel knows it needs to do something. If Israel shows that it's not able or willing to defend itself, it will be open season for all of these Arab nations around Israel. And that's why, in contemporary news, Israel had to respond to the Iranian attack on their country with their counterstrike of their own, not because they want to fight Iran, but because they know if they let another country fire 300 missiles at them and you do nothing about it, well, what's to stop them from doing it again and again and again, likely escalating the scale and the scope of such attacks? Furthermore, there is a limited amount of time the Israelis have to act. Israel has a small population that relies on mobilizing its reservists to compete with the far more populous Arab nations around it. But with all these workers taken out of the civilian economy for the duration of the crisis, this mobilization incurs a significant economic cost. In an effort to try and diffuse the situation diplomatically, the Israelis reach out first to the French, their traditional supporter since the 1950s, and the supplier of most of their advanced military equipment. However, they're turned away by the French. They state that it's not 1957 anymore. Back then, the French were fighting an insurgency in Algeria and had common cause against the Arab states. But since having lost Algeria in 1962, they want to curry favor in the Arab world. When the Israelis reach out to the British, they receive somewhat more support, but this is the moral support that's not actually concrete or material. What the Israelis are actually seeking is some sort of concrete security guarantee or agreement in the face of Egyptian aggression, but they don't find it here. The Israelis also reach out to the Americans. President Johnson tells the Israelis to wait for the United Nations to figure things out. At the time, after all, America is involved very heavily in the Vietnam War. They have no desire for another confrontation with the Soviets, nor do they want to back a second war while being so heavily involved in one already. A short while later, the U.S. proposes what would become known as the Regatta Plan, a freedom of navigation patrol through the Straits of Tiran with an international coalition of ships. Freedom of navigation patrols are done in places where local countries claim international waters as their own, and it's a way of saying, well, we think this is still international waters, and we're going to sail through it. What are you going to do about it? Of course, there are a few problems with the Regatta Plan. First, it will take at least a few weeks to get buy-in from other countries and get the ships together. And secondly, it doesn't actually solve the issue. What's to stop the Egyptians from letting one convoy go by, and then when Israeli ships try to go through, then the Egyptians stop them? Are the international forces going to escort every single Israeli-bound ship for the next 5 or 10 or 20 years? Meanwhile, while Israel is trying to get concrete security guarantees or agreements as a hedge against the Egyptian moves, the Egyptians themselves are trying to figure out what they want to do. There's a lot of confusion in the ranks and among the Egyptian leadership over the purpose of moving troops into the Sinai. Over the intervening years since the Suez War, the Egyptians have developed a defensive plan called Curtain, which was established along Soviet doctrine. In accordance with this doctrine, there would be 3 lines of defense: a flexible disruption force on the border, not intended to stop the attackers outright, but to slow them down, disrupt them, and set conditions for defeating the attack at the second line. The second line is the main line of defense, about 50 miles behind the first, intended to stop the enemy attack. And then finally, a third line has mobile reserves, which can be used to counterattack the enemy once they're exhausted at the main battle line and drive them back. However, shortly after deploying troops to the Sinai, the Egyptians change their plans and start implementing a different one called Dawn for a surprise attack on Israel. This changes the troop dispositions and masses forces forward, closer to the border, to strike into the Negev desert and then northward into the rest of Israel. The troops themselves are equally confused. There is no commander's intent given on their deployment. In the Egyptian army, soldiers were expected to obey their orders without question and without needing to understand the bigger picture. These changing plans and troop dispositions lead to much confusion as units move around the desert, and it also muddies the water for the Israelis trying to use their intelligence to discern what the Egyptians are actually up to. Furthermore, Egypt conducts reconnaissance flights over Israel. In particular, a flight of aircraft fly over the Israeli nuclear reactor at Dimona at high altitude. This facility was built after the Suez War with the help of the French, and it's an open secret that Israel used this facility to develop their own nuclear weapons. Though Israel has never officially acknowledged having nuclear weapons, it's clear they built them as a weapon of last resort, being a nation faced with annihilation by its surrounding foes, and there are reports that indicate their first nuclear weapons may have been on hand at the time the Six-Day War occurred. The Israelis fear the reconnaissance flights are a precursor of a strike on the nuclear plant directly, followed by an Egyptian ground advance through the Negev desert to link up with Jordan. Another fear the Israelis have is that the Arabs are going to launch air and missile attacks on Israel's coastal cities, where the vast majority of the population lives, and that they would even use chemical weapons. Given the Nazi use of poison gas to kill millions of Jews in the Holocaust, and the Egyptians using poison gas against their fellow Arabs in Yemen, these are not idle fears. Israeli leaders continue to try and figure out an acceptable solution to the crisis. They know they can't keep their forces mobilized forever, and not only that, the longer the Egyptian forces stay in the Sinai, the more time the Egyptians have to dig in, and that in turn will make any ground offensive against them more costly and have a lower chance of success. There are proposals from UNEF to re-establish their observation post on the Israeli side of the border, but this isn't a particularly popular prospect for the Israelis, as it does nothing to address the blockade at the Strait of Tiran. In the international arena, some countries claim that Israel can just get their oil through a longer route by sailing around through the Mediterranean Sea. But the issue is that it would normalize a de facto blockade of a country and sets a bad precedent for the Arab nations being able to slowly encroach on Israeli territory and sovereignty without serious consequence. The United States urges Israel to not strike the first blow, but that raises its own set of questions among the Israelis. First of all, can Israel even afford to take the first blow from the Arabs? Israel, as I said in the first episode, is like a lightweight boxer surrounded by thugs. If the less skilled opponents manage to land a solid blow, then it's game over regardless of how much skill the boxer has. And what constitutes a first blow? Would it be terrorist attacks? artillery bombardment of farming settlements, small arms fire over the border, a blockade? The Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abba Eban, spoke at the United Nations saying, quote, "Look around this table and imagine a foreign power forcibly closing New York or Montreal, Boston or Marseille, Toulon or Copenhagen, Rio or Tokyo or Bombay Harbor. How would your government react? What would you do? How long would you wait?" End quote. President Johnson expresses his support for Israel, but outside of the Regatta Plan, he's not willing to offer any concrete security guarantees. He blames the constitutional system of checks and balances and says that he can't just commit America to an alliance with Israel without approval from Congress, and that takes time. Israeli diplomats ask if the U.S. would at least permit Israel to act alone, to which the Americans begrudgingly assent, essentially saying, yes, you can go attack Egypt on your own, but we don't like it, and we won't bail you out if you get in trouble. Within the Israeli cabinet, there's extensive debate over what to do. Should they strike first and without support from a great power? In the past, under David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, the Israelis made sure to never act alone. That's why they attacked Egypt in the Suez crisis, because they had guarantees from both the British and the French that they would intervene in concert with Israel in the war. But now, if Israel attacks Egypt alone, they risk alienating their relations with the United States. However, they also don't know how long they can afford to wait to try diplomatic options. In the final week before war breaks out, the noose appears to be tightening around Israel. On May 30th, Jordan, isolated and fearing an Israeli invasion, finally signs an alliance with Egypt and Syria against Israel. This is a humiliating move because it subordinates the Jordanian military to Egyptian control, but Hussein sees it as the only way for him to survive. By aligning himself formally with Egypt and Syria, it would avoid efforts by them to destabilize his regime. It would also give him additional credit from the Palestinians, and would guarantee military assistance if Israel attacks him. Then Saudi Arabia and Iraq pledged forces for a war against Israel and began moving troops towards Jordan and the West Bank. And now the Arabs are confident, and they think that they have Israel in a bind. They plan for Saudi, Iraqi, and Jordanian forces to attack out of the West Bank and bisect Israel. If you recall from the first episode, Israel's narrowest point is only 12 miles wide between the West Bank and the Mediterranean Sea, and Tel Aviv is only 19 miles from the border. While these forces are attacking out of the West Bank, the Egyptians plan on attacking through the Negev to link up with Jordan. And the Egyptians think that even if the Israelis were to attack them first, they would surely be able to absorb the blow with their larger numbers and then defeat Israel. Again, defeat meaning destroying Israel. As the crisis continues to develop, diplomatic options seem less and less likely. Beyond the initial problems with the Regatta Plan and not actually solving the underlying issues, the United States finds that, when it comes down to it, no one else is willing to actually send vessels to take part in the Regatta convoy through the Strait of Tiran. Furthermore, the Israeli government is paralyzed between deciding whether they should attack or not attack. Faced with this impasse, the Prime Minister brings in a dynamic and enigmatic figure out of retirement by the name of Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan, now appointed as the Defense Minister, is a confident, decisive, and controversial figure. He wears a distinctive eye patch over his left eye, which he gained during World War II when fighting the Vichy French as part of the British forces. He was looking through binoculars when a sniper's bullet hits the binoculars and the shrapnel caused him to lose his eye. Dayan firmly believes that Israel needs to strike first, as doing so would allow Israel to seize and maintain the initiative. In military terms, having the initiative means that you're the one doing the actions and the enemy is reacting to your moves. And in this case, Dayan believes that maintaining the initiative will allow the Israelis to keep from getting pinned down and mobbed by superior numbers of their enemies. His plan is to mass forces against Egypt and launch a surprise attack to try and level the playing field, while doing everything possible to avoid provoking a broader war with Jordan or Syria. The Israeli leaders know that a UN ceasefire will likely be imposed as early as 3 days after the war starts, and they want to be able to achieve their objectives, namely defeating the Egyptian army in the Sinai and reopening the Strait of Tiran, before time runs out and the war is stopped. They ultimately decide to strike on the morning of Monday, June 5th, 1967. Now, before we close out this episode, I'm going to do a quick survey of the military balance of power between Israel and its neighbors at the start of the war. First, the Israeli Defense Forces. The IDF has significantly matured since 1956, particularly in refining their doctrine, command and control, force structure, and their operational thinking. Geopolitically, the Israelis face the prospect of fighting a multi-front war with no strategic depth to fall back on. This is a similar situation faced by Germany, but to an extreme. You see, the Germans in Central Europe faced opponents on multiple fronts, namely France to the west and the Russians to the east, and they had few defensible borders to fall back on. And so their solution and the Israeli one were very similar. They realized they needed to build and train their armed forces to win wars rapidly and decisively and take risks, because if they don't take risks and they don't act quickly, they will be overwhelmed by their more numerous enemies on multiple fronts. One of the ways the Israelis are trying to achieve this is by putting a strong emphasis on the Israeli Air Force. The IAF gets about 50% of the Israeli defense budget and the highest quality candidates. With 250 combat aircraft, the IAF is the second largest air force in the region, behind only Egypt. And the Israelis see air superiority being a significant force multiplier in military operations. And furthermore, the compact geography of Israel gives them great flexibility. Planes flying from a single airbase can hit targets in the Sinai in the morning and then strike targets in the Golan Heights later in the day. To further augment their air force, the Israelis put a lot of emphasis on sortie generation, a sortie being a single flight by a combat aircraft. And in this case, they do it by adopting a pit crew style approach to turning aircraft around after a mission. The Israelis are capable of refueling and rearming their aircraft in as short as 15 minutes, as opposed to a more typical time of several hours for the Arab nations. The IDF ground forces put a strong emphasis on tanks, in part because blitzkrieg-style operations allow you to strike rapidly and unexpectedly, and getting inside your opponent's decision cycle and keeping them off guard is a great way of a smaller force defeating a larger one. The Israelis draw a lot of their doctrine and their mindset from the armored warfare theorists and practitioners like J.F.C. Fuller, B.H. Liddell Hart, and the German panzer generals like Guderian. An additional advantage for the Israelis in emphasizing tanks in armored warfare is that, given their small population, tanks provide a lot of firepower per person. As an armor officer, we sometimes say that a single tank platoon, that is 4 tanks and 16 people manning those tanks, has the same firepower as a light infantry battalion of over 400 men. Now, many years ago, when I was a cadet, the infantry instructors would tout the M240 Bravo 7.62 millimeter machine gun is the greatest casualty-producing weapon in a light infantry platoon. A light infantry platoon having about 40 soldiers and equipped with 2 of these M240 Bravos and maybe 1,000 rounds of ammo each. In contrast, on one tank, you have 2 7.62 millimeter machine guns, and those are the lightest weapon on the tank unless you consider personal rifles or pistols. And the tanks carry 11,000 rounds of 7.62. Furthermore, my personal weapon as a tank commander is a 50 caliber machine gun with 1,000 rounds, and then you have the main cannon itself. But I digress. The Israeli tanks are a mixture of older tanks that the Israelis have modernized, including World War II era M4 Shermans that have been upgunned to keep them competitive on the battlefield, as well as some lightly armored AMX-13 tanks that they bought from the French. And then they have their newer tanks, the American M48 Patton tanks, which they've acquired from West Germany, and British Centurion tanks. Those tend to emphasize armor protection with an eye towards keeping the crews alive at the expense of speed and weight. At a higher level, the Israelis maintain a great deal of flexibility in their planning and execution of operations. They take the German approach of Auftragtaktik, roughly translated as mission-type tactics, in which soldiers and leaders need to understand the commander's intent and not just the specific orders of the mission. This way, if things don't go according to plan, and in warfare, things rarely go exactly according to plan, subordinate leaders can now make decisions using their own initiative to still fulfill the original intent of the mission. If done properly, this allows an army to be able to react much faster than a centralized command structure, and it increases the chance that the mission will still get accomplished despite enemy action or other kinds of unpredictable events that happen in war. However, this also requires a highly trained force and trust within the command that subordinate leaders will be able to use that initiative properly. Much as in the 1956 war, the Israeli unit of action is the brigade. That is, the basic building blocks of their force is at the brigade level, and their division headquarters serve more as a coordinating body for those brigades. Therefore, IDF brigades are not permanently attached or associated with a given division headquarters. They are assigned or reassigned based on the needs of the mission. However, having learnt from the Suez War, the Israelis have increased the staff on their divisions and adapted their doctrine to allow for greater centralized control on a case-by-case basis, with the default remaining decentralized execution and viewing plans as simply a basis for change. To the north, the Syrians are mostly equipped with Soviet tanks and weaponry. Their forces have been digging in on the Golan Heights for over 18 years, extensively fortifying their positions and using their vantage point over the Jordan River Valley to establish observation posts for artillery. The Syrian army consists of about 70,000 troops, of which about half are deployed along the Golan Heights or in the area immediately behind it. The Syrians operate independent brigades, largely out of fear of concentrating power in a division-level headquarters, given their history of coups and political instability. That instability carries over to the army itself. There is a lot of factionalism and dissent within the army, and at times orders from higher headquarters are simply ignored, and the unit commanders just do what they want to do. The Syrian Air Force has about 80 aircraft, although given the Israelis shot down 6 of their modern MiG-21 fighters over Damascus and took 0 losses, the quality of that force is somewhat in doubt. To the east, the Jordanians are equipped with British and American equipment, such as British Centurion tanks or American Pattons, and they are the most professional of the Arab armies and accounted very well for themselves in 1948 and 1949. However, the Jordanian army, about 40,000 soldiers, is spread around the border of the West Bank out of political concerns. Hussein does not want to face the backlash from the Palestinians if he doesn't protect them. But, in spreading his force out thinly along the border, this makes it relatively easy for the Israelis to concentrate enough forces along a single axis of advance to be able to break through those defenses. And once they do that, the remaining Jordanian forces on the border are going to be out of position to respond to the Israelis. As a result of this, the Jordanians plan on seizing the Israeli-held western part of Jerusalem when the war breaks out and using that as a bargaining chip in the post-conflict negotiations in order to retain some of the territory they're going to lose in the West Bank. The Jordanian Air Force is small, 24 combat aircraft, though there is the prospect of receiving help from the Iraqi Air Force and ground forces when the war breaks out. And finally, Egypt is the strongest Arab nation adjoining Israel, backed lavishly by the Soviet Union and their equipment. Their air force is also the largest in the region, with over 300 modern aircraft, and their ground forces, over 100,000 troops and about 1,000 tanks in the Sinai alone, is immense. Although the quality of their troops may not be as high as the Jordanians, much less the Israelis, they are a coherent military force, and many of its soldiers are veterans of the fighting in Yemen or from the Suez War. Overall, the Israelis find themselves outnumbered about 3-1 in terms of tanks, soldiers, and aircraft, whereas by convention an attacking force should outnumber the enemy by 3-1, not the other way around. Of course, by having the initiative, the Israelis can concentrate their forces and try to achieve local superiority, or at least parity. The Israelis cannot afford to play conservatively. They have to take calculated risks. If not, they will be overwhelmed and ground down by their enemies. And so, the Israelis are going to risk launching a massive surprise attack from the air to take the Egyptian Air Force out of the war. Tune in next time for the 3rd episode on the 6-Day War, called The Die is Cast. That episode is going to look at the first days of the war, in which Israel attacks Egypt, Jordan attacks Israel, and the war begins. Thank you, and have a great day.